Hi, welcome to the 11th episode of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. In my podcast, I discuss topics relating to German culture. I also explore German language related topics, and not just German culture, but also Germany as a country, the systems in place, the history, how the history has impacted the present. For example, in my most recent podcast, I focused on migration patterns and settlement patterns and how, first off, how the partition era of Western and Eastern Germany, how that affected migration, and also, tying it back to the present with the nationalistic movement that's happening in Germany right now, in the government, and the anti-immigrant, sentiment almost in the country right now. So because what's happening is all good. I'm not going to go that much detail because this isn't the topic of the podcast, but I just want to provide an example. So Pete, there's a lot of conflict in Germany right now, and a lot of natives don't like immigrants. Let's put it simply. So we're focusing in the podcast. We're going to talk about historical events, how they relate to the present, cultural events, German as a language. I started off learning German as a language, and before my sophomore year, I'm going to be a rising junior, basically a rising junior, but the school year starts in a week, so I am a junior, I guess. I started off learning German my sophomore year, the language, and then from doing my online course for German, to learning German, I worked on German culture stuff, and I became interested in that. So I started researching and spending time learning more, and that's why I decided to create the podcast, just to discuss it, because I do a lot of research on my own, so I can share my knowledge that I learn. And it's not like I know anything. I just read up and I try and find out more. And then in my podcast, each podcast, I'll do research on my own on a topic, and then I'll have a podcast that's 30 to 40 minutes long, and just discussing it. My podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the podcast platforms, and I also upload it on YouTube. The YouTube channel is called German with Lakshman, and that's really it. My podcast is called Thoughts with Lakshman, and I use the Anchor app to record my podcast. So in this episode of my podcast, I'm going to be focusing on sort of like, I don't know the best way to describe it, but German as a language, I guess you could say, and then also other languages in Germany, and other countries where German's spoken. So just a bit of background. German is a West Germanic language, and it's mainly spoken in Central Europe. It's most widely spoken in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, parts of Italy, and parts of Belgium, but mainly the countries that speak German are Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and it's one of the 3 official languages of Luxembourg, which is, I guess, another country. It's a smaller country, and it's a co-official language in Poland. German as a language is most similar to other language within the West Germanic language branch, and that includes, Afrikaans, which is spoken in South Africa, Dutch, English, the Frisian languages, and Yiddish. It also contains close similarities in vocabulary to Danish, Norwegian, Swedish. Well, they belong to the North Germanic language group. And German is the second most widely spoken Germanic language after English. So this doesn't include Spanish. So Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world, and then there's also, Hindi and Chinese and Mandarin. But in terms of Germanic languages, German is the second most spoken language in the world after English. And, one of the major languages of the world, German, it's a native language to almost 100 million people worldwide. And not only that, but it's the most widely spoken language in the European Union. German is the third most common spoken foreign language in the EU after English and French, making it the second biggest language in the EU in terms of overall speakers. So just to clear up that, because I think it's a little confusing with my notes. So German is the most native speakers in the EU, but more overall people speak English and French in the EU, so it's the third most commonly spoken language. German is also the second most widely taught foreign language in the EU after English. And that's interesting because in the US it's not. And I have an entire podcast that actually focuses on this. But in short, German actually was the most common foreign language taught in the U.S. for many years in the 18th and 19th century because there were a lot of German immigrants in the colonies. But in the 20th century, with World War I and World War II, there's a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States, and because of this, they stopped teaching German as a language in many schools. It started being taught again, but for example, the percents, I think it was at around 75 to 80%. At one point in time, the schools in the U.S. that taught German, then it dropped to like zero for or I don't think zero, but like less than 5% for like a solid 50 years. Right now, today, I believe the number's around 21% of schools teach German, but that's much, much less than, that doesn't compete with Spanish or French. But it is the fourth most widely taught non-English language in the U.S. So yeah, Spanish, French, and American Sign Language. And it's the second most commonly used scientific language and the third most widely used language on websites after English and Russian. The German-speaking countries are ranked 5th in terms of annual publication of new books. And on top of that, with the annual publication of new books, 1/10 of all books in the world being published are actually, published in German. In the United Kingdom, German and French are the most sought after foreign languages for business. And 49% to 50% of businesses actually identify these two languages as the most useful, respectively. German is an inflected language with 4 cases, nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, so like Latin, 3 genders, masculine, feminine, neuter, and 2 numbers, singular and plural. It also has strong and weak verbs. It derives the majority of its vocabulary from the ancient Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. Some of its vocabulary is derived from Latin and Greek, and fewer words are borrowed from French and modern English. German is a plucentric language, with its standard variants being German, Austrian, and Swiss Standard German. It is also notable for its broad spectrum of dialects, with many varieties existing in Europe and other parts of the world. And we're going to spend a lot of time in our podcast discussing the different dialects. Italy recognizes all the German-speaking minorities in its territories as nationally historic minorities and actually protects the varieties of German spoken in several regions of northern Italy. And due to the limited intelligibility between certain varieties, and Standard German, as well as, almost a lack of an undisputed scientific distinguish between a dialect and a language. Some German varieties or dialect groups, can be described as either languages or dialects. So let's focus now on geographic distribution of German as a language. So 78% of German speakers worldwide are in Germany, 8% in Austria, 5% in Switzerland, 0.4% in Italy, and 7% around the rest of the world in other countries. And due to the German, diaspora, as well as German being the second most widely spoken language in Europe and the third most widely taught foreign language in the US and the EU in upper secondary education, amongst others, the geographical distribution of German speakers or Germanophones spans all inhabited continents, really. And as for the number of speakers of any language worldwide, an assessment is always compromised by the lack of sufficient reliable data. And for an exact global number of native German speakers, this is further complicated by the existence of several varieties whose status as separate languages or dialects is disputed for political or linguistic reasons, including quantitatively strong varieties like certain forms of Alemannic and Low German. And depending on the exclusion or inclusion of certain varieties, it's estimated that approximately 90 to 95 million people speak German as a first language, and another 25 million as a second language. And this would imply. Oh, and also I forgot. Yes, I skipped over something in my notes too. So, um, another 75 to 100 million actually knows some level of German, like, and not just like high or low, but like decent enough German so that they'd able to they'd survive in Germany. They'd be able to, get by in Germany. And this would imply that the existence of approximately Germans, the existence of approximately around 200 million, right? If you do the math, maybe 175 to 200 million German speakers worldwide. And it's also estimated that including every person studying German, regardless of their actual proficiency. So before we were talking about people who were decently proficient to very proficient. Around 280 million people worldwide at least have some knowledge of German. So these are people who took German in school, and then after school was over, they didn't really enjoy it that much. And when they didn't have to learn it, they stopped learning it and they forgot most of it many years later. But they still know basic levels of German. So just looking through some maps right now, trying to describe, because I put them in my notes for the podcast. German isn't, spoken much in Asia. That can be expected. In the part of Italy, in parts of Italy, German is spoken. There are parts of Italy actually also where German's spoken, but mainly Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and in Europe, German is the second most widely spoken mother tongue, and the second biggest language in terms of overall speakers. And the area in Central Europe where the majority of the population speaks German as a first language and has German as a co-official language is called the German Sprachraum. And the German Sprachraum comprises of an estimated 88 million native speakers and another 10 million speakers who speak German as a second or third language. And excluding, regional minority languages, German is the official language of Germany, Austria, and 17 regions of Switzerland, along with Liechtenstein. And German is a co-official language in Italy, Belgium, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. Outside of the German Sprachraum, which is the little area in Europe, it's not little, it's a significant area actually, where German is, either the first language or a co-official language. There are other areas where German's spoken, although expulsions and, assimilation after the two world wars greatly diminished them. Minority communities, though, still exist of, bilingual German native speakers in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Hungary, and like I said earlier, there's a part of Italy that actually it's a significant, well, it's not significant, but it's a distinct part of Italy that speaks German. Poland, Romania is another country, Russia, Slovakia, and Ukraine. In France, however, the High German varieties, they're identified as regional languages, but it hasn't yet been ratified by the government as an official language. And in Netherlands, different dialects of German are widely spoken, but they haven't also been considered separate languages and officially recognized. Now, so let's focus more on German as a language itself. And yeah, so the first part of the podcast we focus more on stats and facts about German. Now let's focus on what makes up German. So the basis of standard German is the Luther Bible, and this is translated by Martin Luther. And this originated from the Saxon court language. Now, there are places where the traditional regional dialects have been replaced by new, vernaculars based on standard German, and that is the case in large stretches of northern Germany, but also in major cities in other parts of the country. And it's important to note that the colloquial standard German differs greatly from the formal written language, especially in grammar and syntax, in which it has been influenced greatly by dialect speech. And, standard German differs regionally among German-speaking countries in vocabulary, in some instances of pronunciation, and even grammar and orthography. This variation, though, must not be confused with the variation of local dialects. Even though the regional varieties of standard German are only somewhat influenced by the local dialects, they are very distinct, and thus German is considered a plucentric language. In most regions, the speakers use a continuum form, more dialectical varieties to more standard varieties depending on the circumstances. And yes, let's get deeper into it. So the varieties of standard German. So in German linguistics, German dialects are distinguished from varieties of standard German. The varieties of standard German refer to the different, local varieties of the pluricentric standard German. And these different dialects, they basically only differ slightly, and in certain regions, they've replaced the traditional German dialects, especially in northern Germany, with more modern dialect. More or less, the core of the language is still the same. But remember, dialects, a bit of pronunciation, a bit of words that are common here in one region and not so common in another, and a lot of it has to do with the geographical location. For example, in Switzerland, Swiss and German are similar languages, and there's some overlap. So in the German that's spoken in Switzerland, it's different than the German that's spoken in, southern Germany, even though they're both German
And even though both of those people would be able to easily converse, um, some parts of the language might be a little different between those two because of the different dialects. And you have German Standard German, you have Austrian Standard German, you have Swiss Standard German. So, like I described with Switzerland, the same thing could apply for Austria. And in the German-speaking parts of Switzerland, mixtures of dialect and standard are very seldom used, um, because the Standard German's really written. Really, Standard German's really common for as the written language. But the dialects are more common when you're speaking it. And Swiss Standard German, for example, is used in the Swiss education system, while Austrian Standard German is officially used in the Austrian education system. And these Standard Germans are basically, the combinations of Austrian and German and Swiss and German. But it's mainly German, but just a few little Swiss parts and pronunciations and touches. A mixture of dialect and standard does not normally occur in northern Germany either. And the traditional varieties in northern Germany are Low German, whereas Standard German is a High German variety. And because the linguistic difference is greater, they don't mesh with Standard German the way that High German dialects can. Um, but generally speaking, about the dialectical divisions of Germany, they were once of conspicuous significance for the ethnic and cultural distinctions they implied. But they persist despite leveling and standardizing influences such as mass education, communication, and migration and the trend among the younger, better educated, more mobile ranks of society to speak in accentless German. So dialects are becoming less and less common. However, especially with young people, they're less common. However, they're still there. They're not extinct. And especially, like I said earlier, with countries that recognize German, the many people speak German, but they also have another major language, and they're similar. Um, you know, Standard German itself actually is something of a hybrid language in origin. Um, it's drawn from elements of the dialect spoken in in uh, in the central and southern districts, but with the phonetic characteristics of the northern spoken, the German that's spoken in the north. And the pronunciation of Standard German, it's almost like a compromise that gained recognition only in the late 19th century. And even today, the most accent conscious of the well educated speak with the coloration of their native district's dialect, especially if they're from a southern region of Germany. The three major dialectical divisions of Germany coincide almost identically, I guess you could say, with the major topographic regions. So you've got the North German plain, which speaks Low German, Central German, and then Southern German speaks Upper German. So then basically Central German, and the North and the South is flipped of what you would expect it to be. Of the Upper German dialects, the Alemannic branch in the southwest is subdivided into Swabian, Low Alemannic, and High Alemannic. In Swabian, the most widespread and still ascending form is spoken to the west and south of Stuttgart and as far east as Augsburg. Low Alemannic is spoken in Baden-Württemberg and Alsace, and High Alemannic is the dialect of German-speaking Switzerland. The Bavarian dialect has many local variations, and it's spoken in areas south of the Danube River and east of the Lech River. And I guess you could say throughout all of Austria. Central German dialect helped to form the basis, really, of modern Standard German. The present day influence of the Central German dialect is really significant. You could say East Franconian is another dialect, and it's spoken in northern Bavaria, and South Franconian in northern Baden-Württemberg. The Rhenish Franconian dialect extends northwest, from approximately Metz in France, throughout the states of the Rhineland and Palestine and Hessen. Moselle Franconian extends from Luxembourg through the Moselle Valley districts and across the Rhine into the Westerwald. Ripuarian Franconian begins roughly near Aachen at the Dutch-Belgian border and spreads across the Rhine between Dusseldorf and Bonn into the Sauerland. And then finally, the dialect known as Low German or Plattdeutsch. It was historically spoken in all regions occupied by the Saxons and spread across the whole of the North German plain. And although it has been largely displaced by Standard German, it is still widely spoken, and especially among elderly and rural inhabitants in the areas near the North and Baltic Seas. And it's actually also used in some radio broadcasts, newspapers, and educational programs. Tiny pockets of Frisian, which is the German dialect most closely related to English, persist. And remember that there are many, many, many words in German that are very similar to English words. You could get lucky, and you could probably read a newspaper article, and if there were enough words like that, you would be able to get by understanding the gist of the article without knowing any German, just by being an English speaker, because there are a lot of words in German that are similar to the English word, which is similar to Spanish. It's similar in actually to all languages for some words, but German and English, because they're both Germanic languages, they have some distinct similarities. Um, Foreign immigrants, more widespread education, and the influence of the United States and globalization have really helped to create, almost a polyglot of languages in major German cities. But yeah, so just to recap, there are many different dialects of German. You've got High Upper German, which is spoken in the southern parts. Low German spoken in the north, and then Central German spoken centrally. Central German has had the greatest influence on the Standard German that's spoken today. And then you also have Swiss Standard German and Austrian Standard German, which is like those are the official languages. That's what's used in schools, and those are, I guess you could say, they're not exactly the same as German Standard German, but they're very similar. They're just because Swiss and German are two major languages in Switzerland, and then Austrian and German are two major languages in Austria. There are similarities, many similarities, and they overlap. So there are a bit of Swiss touches on that version of German, and there are a bit of Austrian touches on the standard Austrian version of German, but more or less they're the same. And then German is they're the second most native German speakers in the EU, or the European Union, and German is the third most widely taught language in schools behind French and Spanish. But yeah, thank you for listening to the podcast. This is the 11th episode of my podcast. I look forward to making many, many more. And yeah, we're going to continue to focus along this sort of line of topics. I'm doing more and more research. Eventually, though, once I feel like I know, I really have a really strong knowledge um, on German culture and the systems and the history, I'm going to consider doing expanding the podcast and then maybe focusing on another country and understanding the way people live there, the society there, the culture there, and I'd really like to focus on a country that's very, very different from Germany. But because then you can really see the contrast. But yeah, thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and goodbye.